So welcome again to the latest in the series of faith and empowerment talks. Pleasure to have you here with us, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, who will be known to many of you, I'm sure, Beth Phillips, who's been a member of our congregation for, well, a year or two? Not quite a year, okay, right. So Beth is the Director of Education and Engagement at the Wolf Institute, and I'm imagining she's going to be saying something a little bit about the Wolf Institute. It's an interfaith research institute in Cambridge. Beth herself is a political theologian like me. Well, not like me, but she is a political theologian, quite a different one to me, actually. And she specializes in moral and political theologies, interfaith relations, and conflict transformation. She has been a lecturer in Christian ethics at Westcott House and a research fellow with the Margaret Beaufort Institute of Theology, both in Cambridge. She's the author of a number of publications, such as Political Theology, a guide for the perplexed. So if you're perplexed about what political theology is, that is the place to start. She's co-edited two other works in political theology, the T&T Clark Reader in Political Theology and the Cambridge Companion to Political Theology, among many other publications. It's a great pleasure to welcome Beth. I've known Beth for a number of years, and we've worked together from time to time, latterly through a project called Building Bridges, which is an annual seminar that meets in different places of the world, bringing together Christian and Muslim scholars to talk about central themes in their faith. And as it happens, both of us are leaving for Tübingen tomorrow morning for the next Building Bridges seminar. So St. Paul's is going to be well represented at that group of scholars. Beth, it's a real pleasure to welcome you. Thanks for coming. Beth's been struggling with a sore throat this week. So we may need to be refilling her glass more than once, but thanks so much for being able to come, and we're so glad that you could make it.
Thank you.
Please welcome Beth.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you for coming this evening. It's really lovely to see you all here. My favorite part about speaking and teaching anytime I do it is always when we get to the part with the questions and the comments. So I will try to get there swiftly and look forward to you asking about the things you want to hear more about or telling me things as well. So let me say a little bit more by way of introduction, though I won't say much. So it was a very kind introduction, Jonathan. Thank you. If I could have I work at the Wolf Institute, and it is an academic interfaith institute, but we do all sorts of things. So we specialize in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. So we want to understand those faiths better. We want to understand and improve the relations between those faith communities, and we want to work to improve relations between religious communities and wider society in general. And we do this a number of ways, through research, and it's a very interdisciplinary kind of place. There are people working in lots of different academic disciplines, doing lots of different types of research: historical, linguistic, sociological, theological, lots of different things. We do education, so we teach ordinands in the Cambridge Theological Federation. We provide the interfaith teaching that happens in the Cambridge Theological Federation. We also teach MPhil students in the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, where there's an MPhil in Jewish-Muslim relations. And we also fund a handful of PhD scholars in the University of Cambridge who are doing projects that overlap with who we are and what we do, and we provide funding for them, and then they also become part of our research and teaching community. We also do some online courses and some occasional courses and a summer school for people who are outside of Cambridge academia. And then we work also in public engagement, and that's a wide variety of things. We do religious diversity training in healthcare. We go into schools to present interfaith workshops. We work sometimes in public policy. And we do lots of things that we call encounter, just bringing people together who might not otherwise have an opportunity to get together. And we partner with a local grassroots interfaith initiative. If that's something that you're interested in, I'd be happy to tell you more about that, because that's something that anyone in Cambridge can go along to, and they meet throughout the year. So that's a little bit about what happens at Wolf. But even though the title for tonight was Interfaith Dialogue, I'm actually going to be talking about interfaith dialogue and some of the other things that I've done and do, and some kind of thematic threads that cut across all of those. So Jonathan mentioned some of the work that I've done in moral and political theology, and that's part of what I'm thinking about when I was sort of thinking about what are the themes that I wanted to talk about tonight, because a lot of the work that I've done revolves in some way or another around conflict and peace and social justice. As he mentioned, I also teach conflict transformation, so that's basically just teaching people skills for how to approach conflict, how to think about conflict, how to listen, how to speak in ways that make conflict an opportunity for something to be learned and something good to happen. I also worked for a few years on a project called The Good Life and the Good Society, which was a course that I was very fortunate to be able to help develop and deliver inside of a high security prison. And the way that we did that course was we took Cambridge students and went into the high security prison and taught the class each week with the Cambridge students and the prison-based students together as the student group. And we talked about what makes for a good life, what makes for a good society, and lots of different kinds of academic and religious perspectives on that. And we encouraged all of the participants to bring their own faith or worldview into the conversations as we discussed those themes. And then we did some ethnographic research around that. So ethnographic research is just when the research, instead of being with books and papers, is more about being with people and listening to them and interviewing and observing. And that's the kind of research I like to do the most. So that's going to come into what I talk about this evening as well. So on the next slide, I have the two themes I want to talk about. Because I think, to me, two of the most important and empowering things that sort of are threads through all of these aspects of my work, including interfaith work, is the importance of learning how to listen well across difference, and the importance of attending to power. So those are the two things I'm going to talk briefly about. So the first theme is listening across difference. And this has been something that's been at the heart of what was happening in that course inside the prison, what I'm teaching when I teach about conflict transformation, and what's happening, of course, when people of different faiths get together. And the first thing I would want to emphasize is the importance of genuinely open and active listening. So that means that for us to be able to really listen well across difference, there has to be a genuine openness to the idea that the other person or the other people have something that I need. That in this encounter, I might learn something, I might grow, things might change. For instance, ethnographic research. When you do ethnographic research and you go to sort of observe what's happening in a certain group of people in a certain place and time, and you do interviews with those sorts of people, you can very much take your own research agenda and just pay attention to the things that sort of prove what you already were setting out to demonstrate or to observe. But of course, the best research of that kind has to have some openness to going and meeting actual people, allowing them to be the actual complex people that they are, and letting that trouble your assumptions and your research agenda, and that you can actually learn something and describe something there that wasn't what you expected. Likewise, it's very important for conflict transformation. In order to listen to someone that you're in a conflict with, that's only going to move forward in a positive way for both people if you can actually listen in a way that is open to the idea that you might be wrong, there might be something right in the other person's perspective that you hadn't recognized before. There might be something in the background that you didn't know about. There might be something about the situation that you haven't been paying attention to. Only with an openness to there being something that you don't already know going into the conversation, can a conversation between people who are in conflict really be transformed into a positive opportunity. And of course, it's also true in interfaith dialogue. There's no point in us getting together to talk about our different faiths if we're not really open to listening to and hearing what other people believe, and believing that there might be something for us to learn from them or from that interaction with them. And as you may have already gathered, I think that part of this openness is about being able to view disagreement and difference as gifts and opportunities instead of seeing them as worries or problems. That difference between people is a good thing. All of the many kinds of differences between us in our cultures, our languages, our ethnicities, all the ways in which human beings are diverse, that those differences are good and enriching. And likewise, the differences that sometimes cause disagreement are not necessarily bad. It's just a kind of difference that needs another kind of attention in order to be seized on as an opportunity rather than a problem. I think that sometimes when people talk about interfaith encounters, some people worry about having this kind of openness when going into conversation with people from another faith. Because there may be a worry that if you go into these kinds of conversations with that kind of openness, won't people lose their faith? Won't we come away from this either believing nothing or people converting? And of course, anything is possible, but I think what most people who engage in these kinds of interfaith encounters find most often, and I'm sure that Jonathan would say the same about his experience in the seminar that he was just talking about, is that encounter in which you really listen to other people's faith and tradition only also drives you deeper into your own tradition, to understand it better and to reflect more deeply on it in light of the insights from other people. And this was also the case in the course in the prison. I mean, what could be more different than a group of people who are students at the University of Cambridge and a group of people who are in a high security prison? And that difference was a profound opportunity. And we did interviews with all the participants afterwards. I think some of the most transformative impact really was for the Cambridge students, and what happened to them and what they were able to reflect on after going into that encounter across difference with some genuine openness. And the next slide is a quote from one of those interviews with a student afterwards, a student named Barney, who said, "If you're not vulnerable, your education will only be further weaponry to defend your existing position. Whereas vulnerability means that you're letting the other person change you in ways that you can't predict or control. But that's the only way to actually grow. And there were several of the Cambridge students that reflected really profoundly in ways they'd never had opportunities to reflect before on what their educational formation had been like, how they'd been formed in their educational opportunities to be competitive, to go into an educational encounter with an agenda, to prove yourself and assert yourself, to go to a text with an agenda, to extract the thing you need to make your argument. And in encountering these fellow students who reside in the high security prison, they suddenly found themselves learning for the sake of learning, and learning alongside people who didn't have any of those performative agendas or agendas for their advancement advancement, but just were profoundly curious. And when they were open with each other about that curiosity, some really amazing things happened. And I think that that's very much like what happens in the best forms of interfaith encounter as well. So that's a bit on listening across difference. Now, attending to power might, I don't know, perhaps be a surprising thing to say, is the other key theme I would want to talk about when thinking about encounter across difference and listening across difference. But that's because anywhere there's difference, there are power dynamics at play. Because anywhere there's two or more human beings, there are power dynamics at play. Because everyone has power, and power can be used in good ways and bad ways, and there are lots of different things that cause power inequalities between us, and we can deal with those power inequalities in good ways, or they can become very dangerous dynamics, and it's something that we have to always attend to. Whenever people are meeting across difference, who has what kinds of power and why and how are they exercising it are always really important questions to ask. I think that one of the reasons that it's important to ask questions about power in any kind of encounter across difference, but I'll speak specifically about interfaith encounter, is in order to avoid paternalism. So in a society like ours, where Christians have historically had the majority of numbers, the structural power, the money, and we still enjoy a lot of privilege because of that, sometimes it's easy for the Christians to act like the hosts and the parental figures in interfaith. And it's really important not to sort of embed that negative power dynamic through paternalism. And one of the best things I ever heard said in this regard was from someone who's one of the leaders of this seminar that we're going to next week. His name is Daniel Madigan. And he said that in an interfaith encounter, neither faith is the host. Neither faith is the one who sets the table or sets the scene. In an interfaith encounter, if we are fellow people of God seeking God, God is the host. And we should come together in that kind of equality of standing before God in an interfaith encounter. I think paternalism, obviously a bunch of Cambridge students going into a prison is just a natural setup for, well, let's take some privileged Cambridge students into the prison and they can teach these poor souls in prison some really important things. But the way the course was designed was to make sure that that was never the dynamic. Both groups of students had to do the exact same application, the exact same interview to be admitted to the course. They had to work together in groups. The Cambridge students weren't allowed to do any extra research that the prison-based students were not going to be able to have access to because of their different resources. Of course, there was nothing we could do to bring equality between the Cambridge students and the prison-based students, but we could make that space of that classroom in that moment as equitable as possible and remove as much of the potential paternalism from it as we could. And that was also one of the things, in addition to the openness and vulnerability, that made amazing things possible there. And when we talk about power and difference, I think that we're always also talking about keeping the importance of reconciliation and the importance of justice in balance with one another. Some of us, because of our personalities, because of where our own experiences, and because of our faith commitments, might be really, really committed to reconciliation, to the idea that people need to forgive one another, be reconciled to one another, find ways to get together and not be enemies. And those are all, of course, incredibly important Christian themes, as is justice. And some people, because of their personalities or their experiences or their theological commitments, are much more focused on justice, that structures and systems need to be put into place so that vulnerable people are protected and dangerous people are stopped from hurting others, and people who do hurt others face the correct consequences for that. And I think the danger always comes when these two things are allowed to be completely separate from one another. When we try to do work across difference that's just about reconciliation that ignores justice, or we try to do work across difference that's just about justice that ignores reconciliation. And the last thing I'll show you is a slide that is from a presentation that I did recently. I got to, this year, for the Cambridge Festival, do conflict transformation for the school groups that come in for the Cambridge Festival. So these were really large groups of year 5 and 6 and year 7 and 8 school students. And those of you who teach in any way know that one of the best ways to get real clarity in your concepts and your teaching is to have to teach it to children. And I came up with this slide and this way of talking about this balance between sense and be important for children. So I said there's 3 different kinds of disagreement. There's difference disagreement. We just have a difference. I would really like some vegetables. You would really like some pasta. It's fine, that's just a difference. This is what makes the world go round, that we're just different. That's a disagreement, but it's fine, it's just a difference. Then there's difficult disagreement, where it feels like the disagreement causes a problem or a conflict or a rupture of some sort, and there's some sort of work to be done to talk through that or work through that. And that's where the skills of conflict transformation come into play, is in those difficult disagreements. But then there are dangerous disagreements, where someone's actually being hurt, where actual harm is being done. So in a context where I'm talking to children, what I said was, that's not when you try to use your conflict transformation skills. That's when you go get a trusted adult and you tell them something very wrong is happening and we need help. So in the context of adults, where we don't have the adults to go to, that's when it's important to think about the relationship between reconciliation and justice. Very easy to be reconciled to someone that there's just a disagreement difference. Trickier, but totally doable to be reconciled to someone where there's a difficult disagreement, but you have to pay attention to justice in that as well. When it's a dangerous disagreement, then it's really about justice, first and foremost. It's about getting people out of harm's way and about stopping people who are doing harm. And I think that that's a really important thing to always bear in mind when we're talking about both relating to people across difference and talking about empowerment, because one of the most important things about being empowered is becoming really attentive to what power is and what power we each have and how we're using it, and how to analyze the power that other people are using and how they're using it. And when that means that things like reconciliation are possible, and when it means that justice is really what's needed. So those are the two themes that I wanted to talk about, and I'm really happy now to take comments or questions on any aspect of that. So we can go right back to the beginning and talk about what is the interfaith work that's done at the Wolf Institute, and what does that look like, or we can talk about either of the themes of listening across difference or attending to power.
Thanks very much indeed, Beth. The floor is open. Okay, we've got a question straight off.
Thank you for your talk. I'm still trying to formulate the question, but I was struck by the student feedback when they said about when they mentioned vulnerability, and perhaps you could explain or maybe give an example in the context of listening or in the context of power dynamics. Yeah. How does vulnerability play? What is it? What does it do, or what does it?
Yes, yeah. So I think, so I'll start with that specific context of the course in the prison, because there were several of the Cambridge students that reflected on this really amazingly in their interviews afterwards. And one of the other students said, she felt like she'd been to who knows how many seminars in which she really could barely remember anything she learned from them, because she sat in the seminar the whole time thinking, what does that mean? What does that mean? How am I going to respond to that? How am I going to say something that sounds intelligent? How am I going to ask the question that impresses the right person in the room? How am I going to use what I just heard in the thing that I need to do tomorrow? That there's always this, the way that we're socialized in Western academia is very, and especially in elite academia, is very much about, self-assertion and proving yourself. And they suddenly found themselves in a situation where they were with other students who didn't feel the need for any of that. They were just genuinely curious and wanted to learn things, and would ask them genuinely curious questions about themselves and what they believed about things, and how they interpreted something that they'd read and what that meant for their lives. And they suddenly found themselves opening up in ways that was just about honestly sharing instead of trying to assert something, improve something, and accomplish something. And I think that really said a lot to me about the posture of listening that we really need to have if we're really trying to have a genuine encounter across difference. There has to be that openness to being curious about the other person, being open to their curiosity about you, and being able to have a back and forth about that really is just about open, curious learning together, instead of, and this is about, and this is the same in conflict transformation, because of course in conflict what very often happens is when the other person is speaking, you're like, in your head, you're thinking of the thing you're gonna say next. You're thinking, yeah, when this person stops talking, I'm gonna say this. And that doesn't allow you to actually hear what the other person is saying. It takes practice and work to really stop and listen to what the other person is saying, instead of just waiting to get to your agenda in the conflict. So yeah, did that? Okay.
Maybe I can ask a follow-up question there about this course. I mean, I know a little bit about it from previous conversations, but as I understand it, it wasn't billed as a faith-based conversation, but it was one in which people could share their faith if they wanted to. So could you say a bit more about how the faith dimension, you know, the permission to talk faith language, made a difference to those encounters?
Yes, and I think that I would say that it's a very similar dynamic at the Wolf Institute, where I have colleagues that are very orthodox practitioners of their faith. I have colleagues that are kind of, I don't know, some may say lapsed practitioners of their faith. Some colleagues who are not religious at all, and the conversations that we have about religion, about faith communities, about social cohesion of all these different people together in society are sort of in that same space, where there isn't any one faith or approach to faith that's the norm from the beginning. But also there's not some supposed pretend neutral secular conversation that we're having. It assumes that everyone has belief, whether that's faith or a different kind of worldview. Everybody has something like belief. And when we listen to one another's, you know, values and concerns and goals and what we think is ultimate, that's when we're learning about, and that's why the topic of what makes for a good life and what makes for a good society was such a fruitful set of questions to begin with, that everybody could kind of bring some of their own convictions to, but then also learn from lots of different perspectives in a way that if people were bringing a faith perspective to that, that was very welcome. If they did not have a faith perspective, that was also very welcome. And some of the things that we were reading were theological, and some of them were philosophical, and some of them were sociological, and I think that there was something profound about that space in which faith and belief was welcome, but it didn't, you know, it wasn't sort of the paternalistic host, but also there wasn't some sort of paternalistic, you know, secularism that made it a place where people felt they couldn't talk about their faith as well. And I think, I think there's a very similar dynamic to that in a lot of the work at Wolf Institute as well. Thank you. Sorry.
I'm wondering whether there was any evidence that the course impacted on society within the prison.
So this is a complicated, sad story because so this was one course that was part of a larger program, and the people who ran the larger program were doing research about that very question. But the last year we ran the courses was 2019, and you may remember the tragedy that happened at Fishmongers Hall in London. Those were my colleagues. That was this program. And after that happened, it all got shut down. So any kind of long-term research about that wasn't possible. Yeah.
Hi, thanks, Elizabeth. Really interesting to hear. I'm embarrassed to say I'd never seen the phrase conflict transformation before. I'm used to hearing conflict resolution.
Yes.
I did a little Google search, and conflict systems transforming to peace systems is really much more helpful way of thinking of things, because of course things can't get resolved, or only certain small things get resolved and the systems stay in place. But however, my question is on sectarianism versus, so interfaith dialogue versus intrafaith dialogue. I was very lucky when I was 11. I went to the Corrymeela Centre in Northern Ireland, which is obviously focused on sectarianism. There is some interfaith dialogue, but it's really amongst Christians.
Yeah.
And, we're all cognizant of the fact that, let's just take Israel as an example, within the Christian worldwide community amongst Catholics, even within the Anglican Communion, evangelicals, there's different stances about Israel. If you look at Islam, you've got Sunni and Shia, etc. Reformed and Orthodox Judaism, which some people could argue is destroying Israel politically at the moment. So there's a lot of interfaith sectarian issues. How does that intersect with the work of the Wolf Institute?
Yeah.
Sorry, it's quite a big question.
Yeah. Let me say a quick word first about, using the phrase conflict transformation, because you probably will have more often heard people talk about conflict resolution or conflict management. And people who do conflict transformation, for the sorts of reasons you just mentioned, prefer that sort of language because very often the language of conflict management or conflict resolution sort of seems to assume it's a problem. It's a problem, and we got to figure out how to shut it down. And we got to end it. We got to manage it and resolve it. Whereas conflict transformation really emphasizes that conflict is part of everyday human life. You can't have interactions with other human beings and not have conflict. And so what are the ways in which it can be seen as a normal part of our interactions where there's always an opportunity to learn and to grow, whether it comes to a resolution or not? Because the skills of conflict transformation may help you come to a resolution, but they're not magic. They can't necessarily do that. But if you practice them, you can still learn and grow from that experience. That's a bit about that. Now, people who do interfaith very often joke that what we do is so much easier than the intra-faith. Because, it's just like, it's easier to go to someone else's house for Christmas and think that their family is delightful than to go gather with your own family and deal with all the stuff. And so, it's sometimes easier for us to be generous and hospitable to people of other faiths than to the people closer to us that we disagree with within our own faith. Ecumenical work within Christianity is equally very, very important, and these same sorts of principles and skills of listening and talking across difference are important there as well. Was there something, am I missing anything about the latter part of the question? Okay, yeah.
Thank you. I think often interfaith encounter comes with this idea that there's an assumption that there's difference, and of course, at first glance, there really is. And then from that, the idea that encountering the other is in order to somehow work through that difference. And I wonder if you could say anything to sort of, question that idea and what else interfaith encounter can look like, what else it can seek to achieve, particularly like what can interfaith encounter look like when it's not necessarily articulated about, sitting down and doing our faith and getting the scriptures out.
Yeah, absolutely.
What else does it look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Because actually, even though the title for this was about interfaith dialogue, I almost never hear the word dialogue at work at the Wolf Institute. It's not in the title of any of our programs that I can think of. We really do talk about encounter and try to create opportunities for encounter. And I think when you only talk about dialogue, it does tend to that sort of solidifies the assumption that it's all about ideas and words. And we need to sit down and hash out the ideas and words. And that's important. I mean, that's kind of what Jonathan and I are going to be doing for the next week to a large degree. It is important. But there's lots of different kinds of encounter. There's the encounter of just doing things together. We're neighbors, so we need to, set up an allotment together. Or we're global neighbors, so we really need to work on the climate crisis together. There's that kind of encounter of just, okay, in these ways we're different, and we're never going to stop being different, but here's something that we both care about, and we need to work on it together. And there's also encounter of just proximity, and I think this is one of the things that is, we're in a paradoxical time where, in some ways, a society like this is more diverse than ever, and people theoretically have more opportunities than ever to meet and be around a huge diversity of people, and yet the way we actually live our lives tends to be around a small circle of people basically just like us, and on screens in an echo chamber with people who are basically just like us. So I think that the encounter of proximity is hugely important right now, and finding more ways to live into that. There's a phrase that's often used in interfaith work, and it's usually used dismissively. That there's all these interfaith gatherings, and they're just tea and samosas. All these people just get together for tea and samosas. And we actually have one of our PhD students that we've been funding has been researching women's interfaith initiatives and talking about the importance of conviviality through food and through creative tasks, and how that makes all sorts of other social and political things possible, and that, we shouldn't be so dismissive of the tea and samosas. So I think, I would always want to emphasize that interfaith work is not just, and maybe even not primarily, dialogue, and certainly not about just hashing out what we disagree and agree about. I think it's more opportunities to really be with one another, encounter one another as fellow human beings and fellow people of faith, and then take seriously what we can learn from that encounter.
Beth, fantastic talk, super interesting. I wanted to bring up the topic of the sacred, and I wonder, just really quite a personal question, really. In your interactions with people of different faiths, I wonder what that has taught you about what is sacred to yourself, or maybe what is surprising about what is sacred to people from different backgrounds. So quite an open question, but about that topic.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer it in any systematic way, but I'll tell you the couple of things that sprung to mind immediately. Because I think actually some of the things that have felt the most sacred and have that kind of depth of impact have been the things that happen adjacent to the planned thing. And that's why I think encounter in person is so important, because you have the thing that you actually gather to do, but then it's often in the soft encounter around that the really important stuff happens. And one of the things that I'm thinking of is, and this was at Building Bridges last year, one of the Muslim colleagues was quoting a text saying, because there isn't the same sort of discourse about miracles, like the miracles of Jesus. There's no like analogous miracles of the Prophet Muhammad, and he said, what we say is that however many miracles a person could do, however miraculous it was, it could still not be any more miraculous than the fact that the sun rises the way it does every day. Now, I'm not saying it exactly as he said it, but it was the most beautiful concept about the sacredness of creation that's around us every day, and how and really grasping how miraculous it is, God's creation that we live in every day. So I think that it's often been moments like that where someone says something almost in passing or adjacent to the actual interfaith task that because it's people just sharing what's important to them that somehow intersects with and connects to something that's really deeply important, to you, I think.
Thanks. I've got two follow-ups. What you were talking about earlier, and this finishes at 7 or what? No. All right, just one. What do you think is the biggest obstacle to interfaith dialogue, and has that changed? So I suppose that's a two-part question.
There are different kinds of obstacles. So one obstacle is, I think the thing that everybody who does interfaith work deals with constantly is preaching to the converted. Like, if you do something that's called interfaith, then the people who show up to it are already convinced that it's important to do interfaith things. So it's, that question of reaching people in faith communities that have never thought about, much less been persuaded by the importance of interfaith. How can they be part of the conversation and part of the encounter? I think that's, there are ways, and it does happen sometimes, but I think that's one of the really tricky ones. Obviously, when there is conflict, like the conflict that's happening right now, that creates huge challenges in interfaith conversations. One of the research projects that we have going right now is called How to Continue Talking, and it's researching Jewish-Muslim relations in the UK right now in the light of the current conflict, and we're learning about where interfaith initiatives have fallen apart because of it, where they have been able to stay strong, where new ones have started, what's made that possible. And that's something that we're still in the middle of looking at. So then hopefully to be able to offer some resources on the other side of that as well about how to keep talking when there's a conflict that in the wider world that makes the conversation at home more difficult. So that's very often an obstacle. And, when it comes specifically to Jewish, Christian, Muslim conversations, Israel, Palestine, it is always a challenge. It's not a deal breaker in most interfaith contexts. I mean, in terms of, like, if we talk about this, then it ends. I think, at Wolf, we're really committed to interfaith encounters that don't avoid the difficult questions. And there are other models that are committed to, building trust over a long period of time before you attempt talking about those most difficult areas. So if it was doctrinal, that would be the Trinity. We're never, ever, ever going to remotely agree about the Trinity. But do we start there? There are some people who've suggested that's where an interfaith conversation between those three faiths should start, because that's the one that's the crux of our disagreement. And other people would say you should talk and work together for years before you even attempt to go near the Trinity, because that's where it's all going to fall apart. So I think, so there are some doctrinal sticking points, there's conflict, and then there's the, how do we continue to help people have the opportunity for encounter who aren't already persuaded that that's something they should be looking for.
Thank you so much. It's been so fascinating. I wonder if you might say a little bit more about the role of gender in interfaith encounter, because some of the encounters I've been a part of, gender's obviously quite important and significant and different in different cultures and religions. So, and I'm very interested in the tea and samosa dynamic.
Yes, yes.
But yes, thank you.
So,
Who makes the tea?
the first thing that I would say is that the first thing to be aware of is that there is a huge diversity of beliefs and expectations and roles and norms within every faith when it comes to gender. And one of the most important things is not making sort of essentializing assumptions about people from another faith community, that because they're from this faith community, they have this specific gender thing going on. And you know, going back to paternalism, I think that's one of the things that sadly you often see in some interfaith contexts that are grassroots, that there are very paternalistic assumptions about Muslim women in particular, that then end up, you know, creating really bad dynamics where those women aren't taken seriously. So I think that's one thing to be really aware of. So yeah, you can't make any assumptions about what people do or do not believe, do or do not practice, just because you know what faith they're from. You're gonna have to actually get to know what are the gender understandings and expectations of that specific community and that specific person. I mean, you know, power dynamics around gender are one of the most complicated and important things, you know, in any context, and it's incredibly complex in interfaith, because you'll have this huge spectrum of belief and practice within each faith, and you know, people from different points on that spectrum coming together into these interfaith settings. So you know, for instance, you may have an interfaith gathering where there are different kinds of Jewish communities represented, and there may be a Reformed Jewish community where, when scripture is read, women put on a skull cap. And then there would be people from another Jewish community where that would never be done. And you know, that's kind of a thing happening in gender dynamics internal to that faith, that then how does that play in the interfaith? It's incredibly complex. And I think, you know, I don't think there's any sort of one size fits all, here's how you approach it. I think it's more a matter of always really seriously attending to that complexity and not slipping into assumptions, and not slipping into essentializing and finding what's the way forward in this specific group of this specific people. But I think you're absolutely right to raise the question, because it's really complex.
We've got time for one or two more questions. I have about 6, so stop me. But we've got a long train journey to talk about. Well, let me try one. So it's clear, isn't it, that in each religious tradition, maybe not every, but in many religious traditions, certainly Christianity, certainly Islam, certainly Judaism, there is a vast spectrum of capacities for dialogue. So, you know, there are certain strands of Christianity that are absolutely resistant to dialogue, put up shutters, put up walls, driven by exclusivism, self-righteousness, and their only communication with others is to tell them they're wrong or to convert them. And you've got exact replicas in every tradition. You know, maybe not Buddhism, perhaps in the same way.
Or Baha'i.
Yeah. And this is in spite of radically different actual beliefs about the world and God and so on and so forth. So it suggests that it's not the content of beliefs that makes people open to dialogue or closed to dialogue. There must be some other factors that are driving this. Can you say something about what are these other factors that, I mean, power you mentioned is one, but what, are these cultural, sociological, are there particular kinds of doctrine that rigidify more than others? What explains the diversity of capacities for openness to dialogue that you see across all these traditions?
Yeah, I think that will be a really complex mixture of things, but I think you're right to say that it's nothing particular to any of those faiths that makes that openness possible or impossible. It's, you know, it's a version of each one, and that's about personalities. It's about human proclivities, and you know, some people dealing with certain ones of those better than others. I mean, you know, it's the same as, you know, people who are not religious who think that all religion is inherently violent and causes conflict. There's nothing about religion that makes people violent. People are violent, and they're violent in the name of their religions, they're violent in the name of their nations, they're violent in the name of their families, they're violent in the name of their own ideologies. Human beings are violent. And I think human beings, given the right or wrong complex mix of experiences of what we're taught, of who we encounter, of how we've experienced the world, we may have been able to see that openness is good and enriching. But we may have been taught to see the world or experience the world in such a way that openness feels dangerous. And the only way to feel safe and sure is to be sure that I'm right and other people are wrong. And I think that's just human, and not, you know, not specifically religious, and certainly not specific to any religion. So I think, you know, there's the potential for that within any belief system.
Thanks. Okay. Looks like we can wind up at this point. So Beth, you've given us a real feast of reflection there based on your own practitioner experience and your own theological work, and your own personality as well, which has come through so clearly. So we're much in your debt for this talk, and it's going to stimulate, I'm sure, further discussions also about what we as a church might do in terms of interfaith connection. You know, we're direct neighbours with Cambridge Muslim College, but we have hardly any connection with them. That bothers me. I don't have a solution, but your talk, I think, invites us to think about how we can start those sorts of conversations. So, Beth, thanks very much indeed. Please give Beth.
Yes, yeah. Yes, so the group is called Interfaith Connection Cambridge, and the Wolf Institute didn't start this. It was started independently by a group of people. It actually started when the war in Ukraine first broke out, and people at Beth Shalom Synagogue said, we should get an interfaith group of people together to pray about this. And from that, those same people kept getting together at different faith venues and discussing different themes, and so Wolf Institute now just supports that initiative through admin and publicity and that kind of thing. So they kind of meet termly, and they go around, they circulate to the different communities that are apart, and right now there's Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Baha'i, Hindu, and Sikh communities that are actively engaged, and we're always looking to engage more. So if you look up Interfaith Connection Cambridge, or go to the Wolf Institute website, it's there as well. And if you sign up for the Wolf Institute newsletter that comes weekly, the announcements of those gatherings are always there as well.
I'm embarrassed that I didn't know about that. So thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, it's really good.
let me add too that, so Cambridge Citizens, this group that's being formed in Cambridge at the moment and that we are signed up to, is itself a kind of interfaith space. It's not religious, but it's like your course. It's open for the articulation of diverse faith perspectives. And in the Cambridge Citizens meetings I've been to, I've had some really good exchanges with people of different faiths.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that we're already doing, actually. So Beth, let's give Beth a warm hand of appreciation.